Section 19 of Psychology, the Cognitive Powers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Colleen Martin. Psychology, the Cognitive Powers by James McCosh. Section 19, Chapter 5, The Power of Composition. Section 1, Its Nature. It puts in new forms and dispositions what had been previously before the mind. First, it contains a diminishing power. Having seen a human being, I can picture a Lilliputian. Children are greatly interested in the feats of Tom Thumb. Secondly, there is an enlarging power. Having seen a man, I can imagine a giant and be entertained with his exploits. Thirdly, there is a separating power. Having seen a church, I can have an image of the steeple apart from the rest of the building. Fourthly, there is a compounding power. Having seen a bull and a bird, I can put the wings of the bird on the body of the bull and fashion a winged bull such as we see on the sculptured slabs of Nineveh. I place this faculty among the reproductive powers, for, far-reaching as it is, it cannot produce anything of which it has not had the elements in a previous experience. Its power is always constructive, never creative. This shows, says Locke, man's power to be much the same in the material and intellectual worlds, the materials in both being such as he hath no power either to make or destroy. A man born blind cannot have the most distant idea of colors, nor can the man born deaf have the dimmest idea of music. But when a person has seen colors, though he should afterwards, like Homer or Milton, be smitten with blindness, he may be able to combine them in unnumbered ways, all different from that in which they are mixed in existing objects, natural or artificial. Give one possessed of fine musical ear and knowledge of sounds, and he may be able to dispose them so as to produce symphonies such as were never heard before, but which, as people now listen to them, make the soul to swell or sink with their swelling or sinking notes. It is the office of the memory to reproduce what has been previously before the mind in the form in which it first appeared, and with the belief that it has been before the mind in time past. The imagination, of which composition is the main element, also reproduces, but it reproduces in new forms and is not accompanied with any belief as to past experience. Both are reflective of objects which have been before the mind, but the one may be compared to the mirror, which reflects what is before it in its proper form and color, whereas the other may be likened to the kaleidoscope, which reflects it in an infinite variety of new shapes and dispositions. Each of these has its peculiar endowments by which it is enabled to accomplish its specific end. The imagination does not, like the memory, disclose realities, but on the other hand, the memory cannot enliven by the varied pictures which are presented by the imagination. Each is beautiful in its own place, provided it is kept in its own place, and the one is not put in the room of the other, as was said severely of an author that he resorted to his imagination for his facts and his memory for his figures. The one is represented by observations, experiments, records, and annals. The other by allegories, myths, statues, paintings, and poems. The one, as Bacon has remarked, is peculiarly the faculty of the historian, the other of the poet and the cultivator of the fine arts. Section 2. The imagination. There is implied, in order to its exercise, 1. The retentive, and 2. The associative power. All its images come from cognitions and ideas which have been before the mind and are retained. They always rise up according to the laws of association of ideas. The imaginations always come up according to the laws of contiguity and correlation, and the peculiar character of them in the individual is mainly determined by the secondary laws of native taste and energy. The fancies of some follow more specifically the laws of contiguity, and things unconnected with each other come up often to delight and amuse us by their liveliness, by their unexpected appearance, by their variety and their curious juxtapositions. As they involve no intellectual strain, we are apt to follow these in our moods of dreaminess or when we are seeking rest and relaxation. Novels are specially fitted to gratify this propensity and are resorted to by those who do not wish to be troubled with much thinking, and by men of business when they wish a cessation from toil. In the case of the former, the constant indulgence in fiction is apt to produce a frivolous turn of mind, more and more indisposed to exertion of any kind. In the case of the latter, the effect may be soothing if kept within proper limits, and the reading not carried too far into the night. But when the scenes are sensational and persons dwell often or too long among them, there may be as much wasting of the nervous power as even by business or study, and the issue a restlessness and dissatisfaction. The end accomplished by poetry, especially narrative and descriptive, is much the same: to occupy the mind with exciting images. But there is this difference between the novel, at least the common novel, and poetry, that the latter is usually more condensed and therefore requires more thought and brings before us a great many correlations of sound and sense. The consequence is that poetry is much better fitted than the novel to produce mental elevation and is less liable to the abuse of excess. The imaginations of others are more disposed to follow the law of correlation, to pursue things that are connected with each other. In our highest poetry and poetical prose, we are called to dwell among interesting, and it may be subtle and far-ranging analogies, and among harmonies often between material and spiritual things, between earthly and heavenly things. Then there may be imagination, as has often been remarked, exercised, and this legitimately, in science. In such cases, the mind proceeds according to the associative principle of correlation and follows connections in reason and in the nature of things between one department of nature and another. But the secondary laws have the main influence in determining the peculiar character of our imaginings. Our tastes, native or acquired, are shown as readily and certainly by the character of our spontaneous musings as by anything else, more so than even by our business pursuits, which may often be determined by external circumstances. Thus, we may give a direction to our fancies by associating what we wish to revive in old forms, or in new, with exercises of intellect, of feeling, and of will. Viewed in this light, we see that we have a greater power over our imaginations than we might at first imagine. What we think about and feel and interest in and attend to habitually will use the privilege of a friend and often visit us when wished for and when not wished for. In fact, we can to some extent determine the character of our imaginations, good or evil, as we do those of our associates, by the friendships we form and the preferences we show. In imagination, there is 1. A picturing power. A mother, let me suppose, looks out of the window of her dwelling to take one other look of a beloved son setting out to a distant land that he may there earn an honorable independence. It is a fond look which she takes, for she knows that on the most favorable supposition a long time must elapse before she can again meet with him. She continues to fix these tear-filled eyes upon him till a winding of the road takes him out of the field of view. When he has turned that corner, she can no longer be said to perceive him with her bodily eyes, but the mind's eye can still contemplate him. For often, often does she imagine to herself that scene with all its accompaniments. Often does the memory recall that son at the particular turn of the road, on a particular day, rainy or sunshiny, in a particular dress, passing round that corner, and as she does, so the whole is, as it were, visible before her. In this, the senses are no longer exercised, but the memory and the imagination may also begin its appropriate work. For not only will the mother recall the scene as it occurred, there will be times when it becomes more ideal, when one part will be separated from another, and when the part selected for more particular contemplation will be mixed with other circumstances. And in various forms it will appear in her night dreams and reappear in her daydreams, and she will picture that son toiling and struggling in that distant land to which he has gone, rising from one step of aggrandizement to another, and returning at last by that same road and round that same corner to this same home, and she will picture herself as receiving him, not as she parted with him, with mingled fears and hopes, but with one unmingled emotion of joy, while he showers upon her a return for that affection which she so profusely lavished on him in his younger years. 2. A constructive power. For the mother not only pictured the past, but put it in new shapes and combinations. Like the prisms, the imagination divides that which passes through it into rich rainbow colors. This last is the highest property of the imagination. It is one of the characteristics of genius. It is a constituent of every kind of invention. The particular character of the invention will be determined by the native tastes and predilections, and by the acquired habits of the individual. If a person have a strong tendency to observe forms, the imagination will call up the shapes in new combinations, and if his talent is cultivated, he may become a painter. If he be disposed to admire the beauties of nature, new landscapes will be apt to appear before his mind, made up of dispositions of objects which he has witnessed in real scenes. When an individual has a mechanical turn, the imagination will ever be prompting him to devise some new instrument or engine, or if his taste be architectural, new buildings will rise in vision before him. If he be a man of great flow of sensibility, he will ever be picturing himself or others, a mother, sister, or wife, in circumstances of joy or sorrow, and at times weaving an imaginary tragedy or comedy in which he and his friends are actors. This is a gift which, like every other, can be cultivated. I know, indeed, that genius is in itself a native endowment. No teacher can communicate it in return for a fee, nor can it be acquired by industry. But unless pains be taken, it is apt to run wild and become useless or even injurious. It admits of direction and improvement. The painter who would rise to eminence in his art must study the finest models and fill his mind with scenes natural and historical, such as he would wish to represent. The poet who would awaken his genius must live and breathe and walk in the midst of objects and incidents such as he would embody in verse. In science, discovery is commonly the reward reaped by a power of invention which has been trained and disciplined. It is seldom that discoveries are made by pure accident. It was, according to the common story, on the occasion of Newton's seeing an apple fall to the ground that the thought flashed on him. This apple is drawn to the earth by the same power which holds the moon in her orbit. But how many people had seen an apple fall without the law of universal gravitation being suggested to them? The thought arose in a mind long trained to accurate observation and disciplined to the discovery of mathematical relations. It was as he gathered up the fragments of a crystal which had fallen from his hands to the ground that the Abbé Howie discovered the principles which regulate the crystallization of minerals. But the idea occurred to one who was addicted to such investigations, and who was in fact studying forms at the very time. On falling in with the bleached skull of a deer in the Hartz forest, Oken exclaimed, "This is a vertebrate column," and started those investigations which have produced a revolution in anatomy. But the view presented itself to one meditating on the very subject, and in a sense prepared for the discovery. Before leaving this head, it is proper to state that the imagination can picture and put into new forms not only the material, but the mental and the spiritual worlds. The mother, in the illustration employed, can not only picture her son in new scenes, she can picture the feelings which he may be supposed to cherish in these scenes, or the feelings with which she herself may contemplate him. Milton, culling what was fairest from the landscapes and gardens which had passed under his view, describes in his Paradise Lost an Eden fairer than any scene now to be found on our globe. But as a still higher and far more successful achievement of his genius, he contrives, by combining and intensifying all the evil propensities of human nature, pride and passion, ambition and enmity to holiness, to set before us Satan contending with the holy angels and with God himself. The poet, the dramatist, the novelist dispose the elements of human nature in all sorts of new shapes and collocations in order to please, to rouse, or instruct us. If I am not mistaken, poetry and fiction generally must be led to deal more and more, in every succeeding age, with the motives, the sentiments, and passions of mankind, not indeed in a scientific or metaphysical manner, but in their actual concrete forms. This is a field very much overlooked by the ancients and left over to the moderns to cultivate. If we leave out of account the book of Job and other portions of the Hebrew scriptures and the plays of Aeschylus and other Greek dramatists, we shall find very little of the deeper moods and feelings of humanity in the poetry of the ancients. The poet who would catch the spirit of modern times must unfold the workings of the soul within as the ancients exhibited the outward incident. I believe that the visible and tangible machinery used in times past by the poets is waxing old and must soon vanish away. We can relish to some extent the allusion to harps and lyres, to nymphs and muses, to Minerva and Apollo by the Greeks and Romans, for they were sincere in the use which they made of them. But it is only indicative of the barrenness of his genius to find the modern youth talking of awaking his lyre when perhaps he never saw a lyre in his life, invoking the muses when he believes that there are no muses, and appealing to Apollo when he knows full well that Apollo cannot help him. Poetry, in order to be true poetry, must come up welling from a true heart. There was nothing artificial in the use of their mythology by Greeks and Romans, but there must always be something unnatural, not to say affected, in the employment of it by the moderns. The old apparatus of the poets is now gone and gone forever, and I, for one, scarcely regret it. But will the scientific character of the age, which believes in astronomy and geology and not at all in ghosts or fairies, admit of any new machinery sensible and bodily? I doubt much if it will, for there would be no sincerity in the use of such, and sincerity must be an element in all genuine poetry. Is the modern then precluded from the exercise of the poetic imagination? Is the time of great poets, as some would hint, necessarily passed away? I, for one, believe no such thing, but I am convinced at the same time that poets who would do in these times what the older poets did in their days must strike out a path different from that in which the ancients walked. The novelist has, it seems to me, already entered on this path. He has described human nature, or at least certain moods of it, its passions, foibles, consistencies, and inconsistencies, and so his works have had a popularity in these latter days far exceeding that of the poet. Poets are read very much in proportion as they deal with mankind. The poetry of Shakespeare ranks higher, I suspect, in this age than that of Milton, and this mainly because the former exhibits human nature in almost every variety of attitude. Most of the greater poets of the past age delighted to daguerreotype the states of the human soul, whether in its moods of quiet communion with nature like Wordsworth, or in the wider excursions of the imagination like Coleridge and Shelley, or in the deeper workings of passion like Byron. Even when bringing before us the objective world, they often expose it to the view by a flash of light struck by the inward feeling awakened. Tennyson, in his In Memoriam, gives us little else than the feeling of sorrow for the departed projecting itself on the external world and darkening it with its shadow. I believe that as the world advances in education and civilization, and entertains a greater number and variety of thoughts on all subjects, and is susceptible of an ever-increasing range of emotions, poetry must take up the theme, the workings of human nature, and make this its favorite subject. This is a mine of which the ancients gathered only the surface gold, but which is open to anyone who has courage and strength to penetrate into its depths and thence to draw exhaustless treasures. As the most inviting of all topics to the poet, I would point to the human soul, to its convictions, its doubts, to its writhings and struggles, in boyhood and manhood, in idleness and in bustle, to its swaying motives, its desperate fights, and its crowning conquests. End of section 19.